So welcome our regular folks, and a special welcome to, I was going to say your irregulars, but that's not quite fair. Those of you who aren't always here, it's grand indeed to see you. We have a great program to share with one another here in just a few moments. Let's get started with tonight's program. A special welcome to Joe Sharpe, whose name is printed right here. Look at that. Joe Sharpe Video. And Joe specifically really wanted to make sure that any other World War II vet among us might join him in that presentation. So John Anderson is also formally here as one of our presenters. So it sounds trite, but thank you for your service, and thank you for being here to share that story too. You may have other things you want to say, other folks you want to introduce, and I'll leave that to you in due course. But let's start with this video, which many of us saw this past summer. It was shown on one of our local television stations. There's also an expanded version of that kind of, that was done as a special newspaper feature, and there's a reproduction of that on the bulletin board if you want to take some time to read through what you're going to see now. In just a moment. But let's start with this, and then we'll pick up with the video, or we'll pick up with the conversation in about 5 minutes.
Stories brought to you by Gary Gruner Chevrolet, Buick GMC in Madras.
1 out of every 7 Central Oregonians is a veteran. In our weekly War Stories series, we introduce you to the stories of Central Oregon War veterans, some who made it back from their war and some who didn't. Tonight, we introduce you to the story of World War II Army veteran Joe Sharpe.
I was born August 6, 1925 in Lakesville, North Carolina. I was the middle child of 3. I completed the 3rd and 4th grade in the same year. And I graduated from high school after only 10 years of schooling. And that's why I entered college in 1941 at the age of 16. It was on December the 23rd, 1943, that I was inducted into the Army. I completed my basic training as a stevedore to load and unload ships. That was what our company was trained to do. January of 45, they sent our unit, which was a company, up to an airfield on the outskirts of Liège, Belgium. And there we loaded artillery shells onto C-47 transport planes to be flown over to the advancing forces. They were getting close to Berlin about that time. I was in the hold of a ship listening to the radio, and I heard an announcement that an atomic bomb had been dropped. You know, I didn't know what it was all about, you know. And then eventually I learned that it was a huge explosion. Did a stint of stateside duty as a military policeman in Harlem, New York. President Truman issued an executive order that called for the fair treatment of all armed forces. And my enlistment was up in September of 48, so it was apparent to me, being a member of the armed forces provided for me a better chance of enjoying my birthright civil rights as a soldier, first and foremost. So I re-enlisted and decided that I would then make a career in the military. But whenever we got into the communities around the post in which we were stationed, we of course could not go to restaurants. We had to ride in segregated conveyances such as trains, buses. And as we sat down at the table to be served, the waiter came over and looked at us, and looked at me. "Are you Puerto Rican?" And of course I said, "No, I'm African American or Negro at that time." And he says, "We don't serve Negroes here." So there I was on the outskirts of Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., on the periphery, that I was denied service in a restaurant because of my race. And that was just one example, you know. Was sent overseas and assigned to an honor guard for the Army headquarters there at Heidelberg, Germany, and then was sent back overseas, where I joined the artillery unit during the time of the Cold War and the Berlin airlift. And after that, I was sent back to the States to Fort Sill, and then I received assignment as an ROTC instructor at my alma mater, North Carolina A&T. And as I walked into the door, there sat this beautiful lady on the right, and he introduced me to Faye. And of course, history is what follows. You know, we got married. We've been married now 57 years. I think the military and my experiences in the military gave me a sound foundation for my life in later life. I'm proud about the fact that every person in our family was able to get a graduate degree, a master's degree. My two daughters, my wife and I both. I could not have imagined back in North Carolina in the 1940s that life would have turned out for me as it has, and that I would have lived as long as I lived to be 92 years old. Beautiful. Wouldn't take $1 million for it.
Thanks to Joe for sharing his story. And a special thanks to Gary Gruner, Chevrolet Buick GMC for sponsoring War Stories and giving us the time and resources to tell the stories of Central Oregon's war veterans. Every Monday night on Central Oregon Daily.
What a great retelling of part of your story. It's not going to be the whole of it. I must say, you look awfully severe in that particular photo.
Fierce.
Don't mess with this man. That's not the Joe I know. You're not that mean. So, thank you. John, you want to come and have a seat up here? John, where are you? There you are. Have a seat, make yourselves comfortable. And again, I think it'd be better for, especially the folks in the back, if you hold that microphone in front of you and use that as you talk. So Joe, John, thank you, and take it from there.
Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, I would just like for you all to meet some dear friends of ours that we have breakfast with every Monday morning over at Jake's Diner, Dinner Brothers. Right here before me is Miss Iola Shoemake. She's an Air Force veteran of World War II. And of course, we have Bob Maxwell, World War II veteran. And let me add, Bob is the oldest living Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. Right here in Bend with us. That's
Wow.
Brand new. And my dear friend Gail. Glad to have you. I'm so happy to be able to speak to you all about my career in the military because it has just about made me who I am, because I was drafted out of high school almost, well, I should say out of college, in 1943. I was drafted into the military in 1943, December the 23rd, 1943. And shortly after that, I had to register for the draft at the age of 18. That was in August of 1943. And 3 months later, I was drafted into the military. But a couple of years before that, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and the nation went into war. And President Roosevelt declared war on both Germany and Japan. So my basic training was done at Indian Tan Gap, Pennsylvania. And I was trained as a stevedore to load and unload the supplies on ships in Europe. So shortly after that, I was sent to Boston, Massachusetts, where there was a military formation getting ready to go overseas. But in the interim, I was guarding Italian prisoners. I did that for about 3 weeks, or 3 months rather. And then in June of 1943, we were put aboard ships and sent over to Europe. We landed at Liverpool about June time of D-Day. And overnight a trip to a southern city of England called Plymouth. We were there for about 3 months, and then we finally were shipped overseas to a place called Cherbourg, France, and this was after the Allied forces had moved further east into France and on their way to Berlin. We stayed there for about 3 or 4 months, and again we were guarding German prisoners at this time. And then the first of 45, we were sent up to Cherbourg, up to Liège, Belgium, to load onto aircraft artillery shells that were to be sent over to Aachen, Germany, where the forces were advancing toward Berlin. The war ended right after Hitler's death, and I thought I was coming home, but instead they sent me to the Philippine Islands, where they were making preparations to invade Japan. And while I was there, I was in the hold of a ship loading onto the supply, overloading on these supplies onto tanks and trucks in preparation for invasion of Japan. And while I was in that hold, the radio rang out with a message saying that a bomb had been dropped. And when I discovered what the significance of that was, I was very happy, because I know that if we had gone into Japan, it would have been a massacre. So the war ended on September the 2nd with the signing of the armistice on the ship by MacArthur. And they offered me a 60-day leave, furlough that is, we call it, and a $360 bonus if I would re-enlist or extend my time into the service. So, being anxious to get back home to mother and my sisters and my father, I took them up on that. And after I completed my 30-day leave, or 60-day leave, I was assigned to New York as a military policeman. Stayed there for about a year, and then they sent me to Japan as a cadre member of the 24th Infantry Regiment, which we were acting as occupation forces in Japan. And if you recall, after the war ended in both Japan and Germany, there was an effort by the country to try and help the nations that we had defeated to rebuild themselves. So I think it was General George C. Marshall that was then a Army general. He established the Marshall Plan, where food and supplies were sent to the defeated countries, and troops were, instead of fighting anymore, they were now trying to help these nations rebuild. So for that reason, we were sent to Japan, and we were formed in the occupation of Japan. And up on Mount Fuji, about 6 months after I got there, I injured my back, and they put me in the hospital at Yokohama and couldn't do anything for me. And they put me on a strap to try and pull me apart. I couldn't get any relief. So they finally put me on a hospital ship. And on the hospital ship back to the States, I sat there I laid there in the bunks almost all the time, and I just daydreamed, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? So it occurred to me that the military would not be a bad option for me to consider. So as I came back to the States and spent some time in the hospital at Walter Reed Hospital, and I think that was mentioned on the film there. And I then was sent to, where was it? I forget now where it was, but anyway, I was sent to Fort Bragg to join the 82nd Airborne Division, right out of the hospital at Walter Reed. That's what they And when, I don't know whether you know what the airborne is all about. They put you out there on that road in the morning at 6 o'clock and run you around the quadrangle there until you can fall. And I had just gotten out of the hospital. So I got out there and tried to do it, and I got about 2 or 3 blocks down, and I fell in the ditch, and the captain was right behind me. He said, "Boy, get up from there." And I tried my best to get up, but couldn't. And that cured me to wanting to be an airborne. So I then joined the artillery unit there at Fort Bragg and was sent to Europe, and ended up at the Army headquarters in Heidelberg, Germany, where I was acting as an honor guard for all the dignitaries that would come over. And that was a charm assignment, because all we did was show up and put on a show. And so that lasted about 3 years, and I came back to the States to Fort Ord, California, where I stayed for a year, and then back to Germany. And then after I spent my time in Germany, I went back to Germany again. So I spent a total of about, I guess, 12 years in Europe. And so when that was all over, I ended up as an ROTC instructor, and that's where I met my wife, Faye. And we were married a year later. And I retired from the military in 1971. And from that point on, I went back to school to complete my undergraduate and graduate degrees, and found employment with the state of North Carolina when I got out. And one of the other assignments that we had before I retired was I was attached to the British Army to control the release of atomic warheads. And at that time, the Allied nations in Europe did not have atomic capability. So this nation supplied them with warheads, which had to be kept under the control of the United States Army. So I was employed. My job was to process release messages if there was a need for the use of the warheads, so that we could release the warheads to the units that had the delivery methods, such as artillery and airplanes and so forth and so on. So that was one of the most enjoyable assignments that I had. One of the reasons why I stayed into the military was that when Truman signed the executive order to integrate the military, I considered staying in the military a little longer, because it was an alternative that I figured was better for me. Being a part of the military, I was spared the, shall we call it, being in the military, I was spared some of the bad history of this country. I was able to move about, was integrated, and we never ran into any problems in the States here, and certainly not overseas, because nothing like that was happening overseas during my career in the military. So basically, that's what it's all about. And if you have any further questions about you want to ask me, I will try and answer. But I want to also let our friend here, John, give us a little spiel on what he has experienced in the military.
Very special. I'm going to stand up at the podium here to give me some support here. Father Jed told me, asked if I would be help or speaking on Veterans Day here. And that was about 3 weeks ago, and I said, sure, that's no problem at all. Well, the last 3 weeks, I probably have thought of this every day. I have revised my talk 14 times, and here I am. And then I met Joe here a short time ago, and we have become fast friends. And this morning here, to hear his talk, I think I should just say thank you very much. I'll see you later. Well, first first thing I'm going to say, I'm 70 years old. Excuse me, 90 years old. The first signs of dementia. Now, not many speakers get up and talk about how old they are at the start, but it is a significance here. Because I represent probably the youngest veteran out of World War II. When I reached this 90-year level, I couldn't imagine it. As a younger person, I did not know anybody 90 years old, literally. But so I'm very thankful for how I've been able to conduct myself here. I'm going to talk a little bit about history of the country. I'm going to talk a little bit about history of myself. And first thing I'm going to say is that being of that age, I was not transferred out of the service, out of the country for service. So I can't tell you any war stories or any problems of this nature here. And that was almost one reason I said, I don't think I should talk. But I see we got a jacket here that says the Bands of Brothers on the back. And they had been very helpful to me, not only answering a lot of my questions, but assuring me that you volunteered for service of your country. And it's not a matter of how many battles you were in, although I would like to say that I was in one. But it is how we conduct ourselves in the savings of this country. I thought many times, what if we had not won the war? What language would we be speaking? And it is almost frightening. But fortunately, we did win, and we were part of the people that were able to realize that we can still elect our representatives. It may be not always to our liking. We can allow us to have guns, although this is a delicate situation with me. And we can protest. And I wish that we could find ways to do this in a maybe somewhat better way. Our social media has been a problem, and our social life has been a problem, especially with the color of our skin. This has bothered me greatly. And I'll talk, if I have time, I may mention a little bit more about that just a little bit later. The first thing I wanted to talk about is my father. My father lost his parents under the age of 4, so he did not know them. He was put into what they called at that time an orphan asylum. I hated that word. But in any event, he went through school, and at the end of this engagement in school, I understand he was offered a scholarship to Cornell University. Well, that never materialized, either from he didn't know what that meant, and he wanted to get out of the world, get into the world. And what did he do? He enlisted in the Navy. 4 years in the Navy gave him what he said, a new life. He became what we call a yeoman first class. And during that time, the 4 years, that's an achievement. And he was the yeoman, or the so-called secretary to the captain of the USS Florida. At the end of his 4 years, unlike Joe, they offered him a petty officer, yeoman's petty officer rating. But he decided, no, I'm going to go out into the world. Well, it wasn't very long after this, there was the rumblings taking place in Germany. And it was a time then when war was declared. Why he did not go back to the naval station, he went in and enlisted in the Army, which is great. But here he had all of this naval experience. But it was amazing to me how he progressed in this new category. One thing I really kind of regret that I didn't really start asking him more questions about his not only his life but his military life. And I think that I might have had a little better idea. Now we're going to about when I was about 12 years old. And we played a lot of ping pong. We were down in our house playing. It happened to be November 11th. In those days, they were called Armistice Day. I may have a time finishing this, but he laid his paddle down on there and started crying. This is the first time I saw my father cry. Dad, what's happened? What's the matter? He came up to me, he looked at his watch, and he says, it's 11 a.m. I said, so? He says, well, that was the hour that we were told that the war was over. Now, here I am, 12, 13 years old. I didn't know much about what's happening here. No television, none of the things that we could see that's taking place. But I was very, very much amazed that after 20 years, he had an emotional feeling about his comrades. That day, in the trenches, they didn't have foxholes then, they had trenches. The Americans heard of this. They threw down their guns, and I don't know if it happened in his trench or the one next to it, but they got up on the land and they or up on the out of the trench, waving their hands. The war is over. Apparently, this German group on the other side hadn't heard about it, and they shot him, and they shot many. This man had probably 5 or 10 minutes of freedom after 3 or 4 years of fighting. This is about the first time I've been able to tell this story without having an emotional thing for myself. But it let me realize how important this life of his in the service, and maybe someday that my life in the service. Well, there was ramblings going on, wars were being talked about, and then 1941 came up. To be more specific, December came up. December 7th was still not a day that I really remember, because it happened at 8 o'clock in Hawaii, 10 o'clock here, Sunday morning. Again, no television. And we don't usually have our radio on at Sunday morning at 8 o'clock. So in any event, we were taken out and taken to church that morning, and I started hearing people talking about what has happened. Later on that day, I started hearing more about this, but not too much detail. So when December 7th wasn't really acknowledged much to me, December 8th was. I came from quite a large high school in Portland, and that morning when we came to school, our regular classes were discontinued because we were going to listen to the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, tell us that we have declared war against Japan and Germany. Now this, I didn't have a room, I guess, with a speaker, so they put me in this our large library here. And that speech of infamy still goes down in my heart. Now, still not realizing really what is this going to mean, but this is the change of not only my life, but all of the people of America. We were getting into, not that day, but we were getting into rationing. 4 gallons of gas a week was all that was allotted to a lot of us. Meatless Tuesdays. Many things that we just were not accustomed to. Industry picked up. We had to make planes. We had to make ships. Goodness, Portland had something like 4 shipyards to construct these vessels for us. Now I was really seeing. So I was still in high school, of course. And still no television. But it was amazing what we were hearing. And we were even hearing people who were coming back from furloughs and saying, what is really taking place? I heard that there was a test being given called the Eddy test in the Navy that would allow us to try to become an electronic technician. Now, I'm going to be hearing words that are not in the dictionary, but I didn't even know what they were about, like radar. Well, I had an idea what radar was, where our enemies are, but I had no idea what it looked like. There were sonar. Well, I knew that was something about depth in the ocean. How are they going to teach me to help to correct or work these? I fortunately passed this test, and I was immediately told that before you get to be 18 and you're going to be eligible for draft, we talk to my parents and say, we want to induct him while he's still in high school. Oh, I thought that was great. I am almost an adult right now. I was so green. But while I was still 17, while I was still in school, I was inducted into the U.S. Navy. They did let me finish high school, but I tell you, it was almost hours afterwards, if not a couple of days. I was on a train to Great Lake Station in the north of Chicago. Another new word, drill instructor. I didn't know really what this was, but I know that they were going to put me in a group to teach me how to march, how to guard, and things of this nature. But I had no idea how they were going to teach me. We were in a place where they had what we call a grinder, and the drill instructor would yell at us. Now, he didn't yell from across the grinder. He yelled at me from 2 inches from my nose. Oh, wait a minute. My father never talked to me like that. And maybe he should have. But the weeks that we were there, we were taught not only how to physically work in the service, but what this means as far as discipline is concerned. And that was the number one advantage that I thought I had when I got out. I had some idea what discipline was. I started to school, and then it wasn't very long afterwards, the bomb was dropped. And I remember I was in Chicago, and I read something in the paper about this huge bomb being dropped. atomic bomb, another word, not in the dictionary. But it's so amazing to me what was taking place. I even looked up on Google a few days ago what Hiroshima, what the bomb meant. One plane, one bomb, enough to fly the plane, flew over to a city in Japan and dropped this bomb. I'm going to have to look at this here. From 39 to 80,000 people were killed. Half of that was the first day. 3 days later, another one plane, one bomb went to Nagasaki. It wasn't as large a city, so only 39,000 people to 80,000 people were killed. 90% of Hiroshima was destroyed. Now this is amazing and frightening. And that was back those many years. And what are we doing now? We're talking about another atomic bomb. Only this bomb, as compared to many bombs, they compare it to Hiroshima. A hydrogen bomb is 1,000 times greater. We have to find ways of negotiating that we will not be enticed by, in this case here, North Korea. So I feel that there is going to be things done, and we can hope we can handle something like this. Now my life in the service is now on a diminishing scale. I'm out of the radar, or out of the electronic schooling, and they sent me to a naval prison to work. I had to specify that. It wasn't a large prison, but it was up to 3 years. And it was another experience in my life that I had never even imagined. And I was also a yeoman in this division. And I had all of the records of all the inmates, and I worked on what they call the Clemency and Restoration Board, which is the parole board. So I got to see that there's a lot of problems in not only military life, but eventually civilian life as far as penal organizations are concerned. War was over. They kept me on for a while, and I was happy to say that I could be in the service of the country here during this time. But when my separation came up, I was then going to go to college. And I had that in mind before. But it amazed me is that one of the benefits that I received was the veterans of the Bill of Rights is what I'm trying to say. And this included helping you through college. Now, what if they didn't have the Bill of Rights? Would I have gone on to college? I hope so. It would be maybe a different life, a different time, a different extension of how to pay for this. But that was the first thing that I really saw physically was given to me was my education. My education was one in which I chose that I could go on throughout past my degree. And I happened to choose dentistry as my profession, and another 4 years. After that, I went on to a residency, and that was another 2 years. Would I have done these things if I hadn't been in the service? I don't know. But I do know that I'm so appreciative of what that part of the service has done. I really have had more to say and want to say more to express my feelings. But when I saw the jacket up here, Van's brother, I'll just have to make a mention of this. I didn't join the Legion after the war or anything, veterans groups like this. But when I did come out here and retire, get to a retirement place, the Band of Brothers was there and helping me greatly. I didn't realize how much, and they were instrumental in helping me feel that, yes, I did not serve in a battle. I did not shoot a gun at anybody, but I did serve my country. And that is what Band Brothers profess for me, and which I greatly appreciate. The Band of Brothers also found ways that they could send me to an honor flight back to Washington, D.C. I have been in Washington, D.C. once before, but never did I see Washington, D.C. like I did 2 years ago. I came back to my retirement home, it's down here at Stone Lodge, and of course, they wanted to hear what my experiences were. I'm having difficulty. I had difficulty then. I could hardly talk about some of the things I saw and some of the things that reminded me of what this country means to me. So I am praying every day in my prayers that we can find peace. We can have a way in which we can learn to live with one another. How we can solve the race problems. Just to mention it, and I wasn't going to, but maybe I do. How did I feel when I saw them kneel for the Star Spangled Banner, or the remembering of the veterans? It bothered me greatly. But yet it is something that we fought for, that they could protest. Unfortunately, their protest did not involve fighting or injuries, but we've got to find a different way. And I think we will. Last week, we had a young man come in here and talk about his summer, who happened to be with the Episcopal Church, and how we can get along better. Of the hundreds of photographs he flashed up on the screen, one stood out to me. One of them. 5 words. Love God and love your neighbor. If we can accept these 5 words, I think we're on the road to having a peace. World War I was designated as the war to finish wars. Well, you know that's not so. And even World War II didn't do that. And neither did Vietnam do that. Neither did Korea do that. It just goes on. So I love my country very much. But I love my God. And I love my service here in Bend. I love being able to hear you talk and hear the many people giving sermons. It's been an inspiration to me. I have asked many prayers, and I have had one answered here. I have my son now. He's moving into Bend, working in a company that he helped consult with. And it is another factor of what God is doing for me. So I thank you very much.
I know you have some family members, Joe and John. I wonder if you always come forward too, that you might welcome you with us today. Family members.
I just want to let you know that during my lifetime we've had 3 or 4 major conflicts. I think there's World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. I served during the Vietnam War and the Korean War, but I did not get into combat. So, and I completed my 28 years with only a broken toe. So for that I'm lucky, and as you've heard, there's been a lot of injury, not only mentally and physically, but in other ways. And adding to what John has said, I just hope that all this turns out well in our country in the future. Amen. War is not the answer. And there have been so many people damaged by these conflicts that we participated in or had to participate in. So thank you for listening to us. This is my family. And anyway, last time I think it was on my birthday, I introduced everybody, but there was one missing. And today we have him with him. That's Tom back there. Come on in. Come up here, Tom. Sterling, come on up. You come with me. What we have to say, and I hope that we shed some light on you. There is 2 memorials in Washington, D.C. that I would like to invite you to take a look at. I remember there's 3. There's the Korean War Memorial, there's the Vietnam War Memorial, and then of course there's the World War II War Memorial. And then there's a whole big picture here of way back